Imagine inheriting your grandparents' dreamy beach house, a slice of paradise just steps from the ocean, filled with childhood memories of sandcastles and sunsets. Now picture this. A woman named Karen, armed with a clipboard and a smug grin, storms in claiming it's hers. Not just a nosy neighbor, but the HOA president who's ready to harass my renters, hire a moving crew, and steal my family's legacy right out from under me. How far would she go? And how far would I fight to stop her? Stick around, because this story's about to get wild. If you're hooked already, smash that like button. Let's get this video to 39 likes. And don't forget to hit subscribe for more crazy tales like this one. Trust me, you won't want to miss how this showdown ends. The salty breeze kissed my face as I stood on the weathered porch of the beach house, staring out at the endless stretch of the Atlantic. The sun was dipping low, painting the sky in streaks of orange and pink, while waves crashed rhythmically against the shore just a few hundred feet away. This wasn't just a house. It was a time capsule of my childhood, a sanctuary built by my grandparents' hands and hearts. I could still hear the echoes of laughter from those long-gone summers. My cousins and I racing barefoot across the dunes, sand sticking to our sunburned skin, while the adults sipped iced tea on this very porch, their voices a soft hum beneath the seagulls' cries. My grandparents, George and Eleanor, had owned this place for over 40 years. It sat perched on a quiet stretch of seaside town 3 hours from my current home. A charming, sleepy spot where the loudest noise was the tide rolling in. They'd bought it in the 70s, back when the town was little more than a fisherman's outpost, and turned it into our family's summer haven. Every July, the whole clan, uncles, aunts, cousins, would pile in, our vacations meticulously aligned so we could spend 2 glorious weeks together. The kids built sandcastles that towered like kingdoms until the tide claimed them, while the grown-ups grilled fish on the rickety barbecue out back, swapping stories late into the night. I'd fall asleep in a hammock to the sound of waves, dreaming of the day I'd bring my own kids here to chase the same magic. But time has a way of slipping through your fingers like sand. My grandparents passed away within a week of each other. Grandpa George's heart gave out first, and Grandma Eleanor, as if unwilling to face a world without him, followed soon after. Their joint funeral was a blur of black dresses and tear-streaked faces, held under a gray sky that mirrored our grief. I was still reeling when their lawyer, Mr. Hargrove, called me a month later. "They left something for you," he'd said, his voice crackling through the phone. "Come to the reading of the will." I drove to his office in a daze, expecting maybe a small keepsake, a watch, a photo album. Instead, he slid a thick envelope across his desk and said, "The beach house is yours." My jaw dropped. The deed was already in my name, meticulously prepared by my grandparents years ago, just waiting for my signature to make it official. I signed it right there, my hand trembling with a mix of disbelief and joy. That house wasn't just wood and shingles. It was a promise, a piece of them I could hold on to forever. The first thing I did was take the 3-hour drive down to see it. The familiar crunch of gravel under my tires felt like a homecoming. The house stood just as I remembered, white clapboard weathered by salt air, a wraparound porch sagging slightly on one side, and windows that caught the sunlight like mirrors. Inside, it smelled of cedar and lemon polish. My grandparents had hired a cleaning crew to come weekly, keeping it pristine even in their absence. I kept the service on, knowing I'd need help maintaining it between family visits. Standing in the living room, I could almost see Grandpa George in his armchair, reading the paper, and Grandma Eleanor bustling in the kitchen, her apron dusted with flour. For a while, I thought about keeping it just for family, recreating those golden summers with my own kids someday. But reality set in. Maintaining a second property wasn't cheap, and I had bills to pay, a mortgage back home, a life to sustain. So, I decided to rent it out as a vacation spot. It made sense, extra income to cover repairs, taxes, and the occasional storm damage, while still keeping it in the family. I listed it online, and soon enough, bookings rolled in, couples on romantic getaways, families craving a week by the sea. The renters loved it, leaving glowing reviews about the cozy bedrooms and the unbeatable view. For the first year, everything went smoothly. The house was alive again, filled with new voices, new stories. But then the trouble started. It came in the form of a crisp, white envelope slipped into my mailbox back home. Not at the beach house, but my primary address, 3 hours inland. I tore it open, expecting a bill or a thank you note from a renter. Instead, it was a welcome to the Seaside Heights HOA packet, complete with a glossy brochure and a dues invoice for $500. I frowned, flipping through it. My grandparents had never mentioned an HOA. They'd owned the house outright, free and clear, and I'd inherited it the same way. The beach house wasn't even in the HOA's gated subdivision. It sat just outside their jurisdiction, on its own plot of land. I tossed the packet in the trash, figuring it was a mistake. A week later, another one arrived. Then an email landed in my inbox from someone named Karen Mitchell, with the subject line, "Property Inquiry, Urgent." I opened it, and my stomach sank. "Dear homeowner," it began in a prim, officious tone. "The Seaside Heights Homeowners Association has identified your property as a valuable asset to our community. We'd like to discuss bringing it under our management for the benefit of all residents. Please respond to schedule a meeting." I stared at the screen, baffled. Management? Benefit of all residents? The house wasn't theirs to claim. I typed a curt reply, "Not interested. My property is private and not part of your HOA. Please stop contacting me." I hit send, thinking that would be the end of it. But I was wrong. Oh, so wrong. Karen Mitchell wasn't the type to take no for an answer. And what started as an annoyance was about to spiral into a nightmare I couldn't have imagined. The beach house, my grandparents' legacy, was about to become a battleground, and I'd soon learn just how far this HOA Karen was willing to go to get her hands on it. The first summer renting out the beach house felt like a dream fulfilled. I'd check my phone between meetings at work, smiling at notifications of new bookings, families from the city craving a sandy escape, retirees celebrating anniversaries with sunset walks. The extra income trickled in, enough to replace the leaky roof after a brutal nor'easter tore through in March. I'd even started a scrapbook of renter reviews, their words like little love letters to the house. A hidden gem, felt like home. Every glowing note made me feel closer to my grandparents, like I was honoring their legacy by sharing it with the world. But the HOA packets kept coming. After that first email from Karen Mitchell, I'd get one every few weeks. Shiny envelopes stuffed with bylaws, maps of their subdivision, and increasingly pointed letters. "Your property's proximity to Seaside Heights makes it a natural fit for our community," one read. "Joining the HOA ensures its value and upkeep." I'd roll my eyes and toss them into a growing pile on my kitchen counter, wondering how they even got my address. My grandparents had warned me about the HOA years ago, back when they tried to pressure them into selling. "Bunch of busybodies with too much time and money," Grandpa George had grumbled, waving off their offers like flies. I figured ignoring them would work just as well for me. For a while it did. The renters kept coming, the cleaning crew kept the place spotless, and I drive down every few months to check on things. Those visits were my reset button, standing on the porch with a coffee mug, watching the tide carve patterns in the sand, feeling the weight of the world lift off my shoulders. But then about a year into owning the house, the emails from Karen got pushier. "We're prepared to offer a generous sum to integrate your property into Seaside Heights," one said. "It'd be a shame to let such a prime location go unmanaged." I fired back another refusal. "Not for sale. Stop contacting me." She went quiet for a couple of months, and I dared to hope she'd given up. Then the phone call started. It was a humid August morning, the kind where the air sticks to your skin like damp cotton. I was pouring cereal for my kids when my phone buzzed, an unknown number with the Seaside Town's area code. "Hello." I answered, half expecting a renter with a question about the Wi-Fi. Instead, a clipped, nasal voice cut through the line. "This is Karen Mitchell, Seaside Heights HOA president. We need to discuss your property." I froze, milk dripping onto the counter as I gripped the phone. "I've told you I'm not interested," I said, keeping my tone even. "The house isn't part of your HOA, and it never will be." There was a pause, then a huff. "You don't understand the benefits," she snapped. Our community maintains standards: landscaping, security, property values. Your little shack could drag us all down if it's not up to code. Shack? My grandparents' house, with its sturdy beams and hand-painted shutters, was no shack. It's my land, my rules, I shot back. And I'm hanging up now. I did, but not before hearing her mutter something about stubborn fools. My hand shook as I set the phone down, a mix of anger and unease bubbling in my chest. Who did this woman think she was? I tried to shake it off, focusing on the renter's next check-in. A sweet couple from Ohio, celebrating their honeymoon. They arrived the next week, and I got a glowing text from them. This place is paradise. The view is unreal. I smiled, picturing them on the porch, clinking wine glasses as the sun sank into the sea. But paradise didn't last. 2 days later, my phone rang again. This time, it was the groom, his voice tight with panic. Some lady just banged on the door, saying we need to leave. She says the HOA owns this house, and we're trespassing. My heart dropped like a stone. What? Stay there. I'm on my way. I grabbed my keys, the deed, and every scrap of paperwork I could find, shoving them into a folder as I called my husband. I'm about to go to the beach house. Some HOA nutcase is harassing the renters. He nodded, worry creasing his brow. Be careful, okay? I promised I would, but as I sped down the highway, the 3-hour drive stretching ahead like an eternity, I wasn't so sure. The road blurred past, pine forests giving way to marshlands, then the familiar salty tang of the coast, but my mind was racing faster than the car. What was Karen doing? How could she just show up and scare people out of my house? I pulled into the gravel drive, just after noon, the sun blazing overhead. The beach house looked serene as ever, its white siding glinting against the blue sky, but the scene out front was anything but peaceful. A cluster of cars lined the road, an old sedan, a pickup truck, and, most alarmingly, a moving van parked crookedly on the lawn. My renter stood on the porch, the groom's arm around his bride, both of them wide-eyed and clutching their phones. And there, striding across my grass like she owned it, was a woman I could only assume was Karen Mitchell. She was shorter than I'd imagined, maybe 5'2", with a severe bob of bleach blonde hair and a clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield. She barked orders at 2 burly guys in faded t-shirts who were unloading boxes from the van. I stepped out of my car, slamming the door hard enough to make heads turn. What the hell is going on here? I demanded, my voice cutting through the sea breeze. Karen spun around, her lips curling into a smug little smile. "Oh, good, you're here," she said, as if I'd been invited to her party. "This property belongs to the Seaside Heights HOA now. These renters haven't paid their dues, so we're clearing it out." I stared at her, disbelief warring with fury. The deed burned a hole in my bag, and I knew one thing for sure. This woman had just crossed a line she couldn't uncross. The air crackled with tension as I stood on my own lawn, the sea breeze whipping my hair into my face. Karen Mitchell's smug grin was like a match to dry tinder, and I felt the heat rising in my chest. Behind her, the moving crew hesitated, their arms full of empty boxes, glancing between us like they weren't sure whose side to take. My renters, the honeymooners, clung to each other on the porch, the bride's eyes darting nervously to the van as if it might swallow their vacation hole. I clutched the folder of paperwork tighter, its edges digging into my palm, grounding me against the absurdity unfolding before me. "Excuse me," I said, my voice sharp enough to slice through the sound of the waves. "This property doesn't belong to your HOA. It's mine, deeded to me by my grandparents. You have no right to be here." I took a step forward, planting myself between Karen and the house like a barricade. She didn't flinch, just tilted her head slightly, her clipboard gleaming in the sunlight like some twisted badge of authority. "Oh, honey," she said, her tone dripping with condescension, "you're mistaken. This house has been under HOA jurisdiction for years. The board finally voted to enforce our claim. Your renters haven't paid a dime in dues, and we're done waiting." She waved a hand at the moving crew. "Go on, boys, start inside. Kitchen first." The 2 men shuffled forward, but I threw up an arm, blocking their path. "Stop right there. I snapped, glaring at them. You step 1 foot in my house, and I'm calling the police for trespassing. They froze, exchanging uneasy looks, clearly not eager to test my resolve. Karen's smile faltered for a split second, but she recovered fast, folding her arms across her chest. Call whoever you want, she sneered. The HOA has documentation, years of records showing this property's ours. You're the one squatting here, pretending it's yours with some flimsy little deed. Flimsy? My grandparents' legacy, the house they'd poured their lives into, reduced to flimsy. I wanted to scream, but I swallowed it down, forcing myself to stay calm. I'd dealt with enough unruly students in my decade as a teacher to know losing my cool wouldn't win this fight. Documentation? I said, raising an eyebrow. Let's see it then, because I've got the deed, signed and notarized, right here. I pulled it from the folder, holding it up so the sunlight caught the official seal. This says I own this house, free and clear. No HOA, no liens, nothing. So unless you've got something better than this, you're the one who needs to leave. Karen's eyes narrowed, but she didn't reach for any papers of her own. Instead, she stepped closer, her heels sinking into the sandy grass. That piece of paper doesn't mean a thing, she hissed. The HOA's been managing this area since before you were born. Your grandparents should have sold when they had the chance. Now it's ours by right. By right? The sheer gall of it made my blood boil. I could almost hear Grandpa George's gruff laugh, telling her where she could shove her right. Back off, I said, my voice low and steady. You're on my land, harassing my renters, and I've had enough. Get your crew and your van off my property, or I'm dialing 911. I pulled my phone from my pocket, thumb hovering over the screen. Karen's smirk returned, colder this time, and she fished her own phone out with a flourish. Go ahead, she said, already tapping at her screen. I'll call them myself. Let's see what the police think of a squatter threatening a lawful HOA operation. She turned away, barking into the phone. Yes, officer, I need assistance at 47 Shoreline Drive. There's a hostile individual interfering with our work. Hostile? I almost laughed at the irony, but the stakes were too high. I dialed anyway, explaining my side to the dispatcher. There's a woman claiming my house belongs to her HOA. She's trespassing with a moving crew, trying to evict my renters. I've got the deed. Please send someone fast. The operator promised a unit within 15 minutes, but as I hung up, I saw Karen waving notes under the renter's door, slips of paper demanding they vacate immediately. The groom caught my eye, holding up one of the notes, his face pale. She's been doing this all morning, he called. Kept saying we'd be arrested if we didn't leave. His bride clutched his arm, tears welling up. My heart ached for them. This was supposed to be their honeymoon, not a front row seat to a property war. I stormed over to Karen, snatching the next note from her hand before she could slide under the door. Enough, I shouted, crumpling it in my fist. You're terrorizing these people over a lie. What's wrong with you? She spun on me, her face flushed red, but before she could retort, sirens wailed in the distance. Relief washed over me. Help was coming. The moving crew backed off, retreating to their van like rats fleeing a sinking ship, while Karen stood her ground, clipboard raised like a shield. 2 police cruisers rolled up, gravel crunching under their tires. An officer stepped out, a burly guy with a no-nonsense frown, and surveyed the scene. All right, he said, voice gruff. Who's in charge here? Karen launched into her spiel first, painting me as a crazed squatter harassing her legitimate operation. I waited, letting her dig her own grave, then handed the officer my deed and the renter's panicked statements. Sir, I said calmly, this is my house. She's got no claim. Check the records. She's the one trespassing. The officer skimmed the deed, then looked at Karen. Ma'am, you got proof of this HOA ownership? Her smugness wavered, and she stammered something about files at the office. The officer sighed, clearly unimpressed. All right, he said, turning to me. We'll sort this out. But for now, nobody's moving anything, or anyone, until I say so. Karen sputtered, but I exhaled, feeling the tide shift in my favor. The fight wasn't over. but I'd drawn first blood. The sun hung low over the horizon, casting long shadows across the beach house lawn as the police officer flipped through my paperwork. His partner, a younger woman with a sharp gaze, kept an eye on Karen, who was pacing near the moving van, her clipboard now dangling uselessly at her side. The renters stood huddled on the porch, watching the scene unfold like a bizarre seaside drama. I could feel the sweat beating on my forehead, the 3-hour drive, and this showdown finally catching up with me. But I stood tall, the deed in the officer's hands my anchor against Karen's storm. "Ma'am," the officer said, turning to Karen, "you're claiming ownership, but I've got a notarized deed here saying otherwise. Where's your proof?" Karen's face twisted, her blonde bob swaying as she jabbed a finger at me. "That's fake," she shrieked. "The HOA's owned this property for years. Check the records." "She's a liar." Her voice cracked, desperation seeping through her bravado. The officer raised an eyebrow, unimpressed, and glanced at his partner. "Run the address," he muttered. She nodded and ducked into the cruiser, radio crackling. I handed over the renter's statements next. Crumpled notes Karen had slipped under the door, threatening eviction. "She's been harassing them all day," I said. "Told them they'd be arrested if they didn't leave. This is my house, and she's got no right." The officer skimmed the notes, his frown deepening. Karen lunged forward, snatching at the papers, but the female officer stepped in, blocking her. "Back off, ma'am," she warned, voice like steel. Karen's mask slipped then. "You're all idiots," she screamed, her face red as the sun set. "I'm the HOA president. This squatter's stealing what's ours." She waved her arms, nearly hitting the mover hovering nearby. He backed away, muttering, "Lady, I'm just here for the paycheck." The officer sighed, rubbing his temple. "Ma'am, calm down, or we're taking this to the station." But Karen didn't calm down. She cursed me out, calling me a thief, a fraud, her voice rising into a banshee wail. It was like watching a meltdown in slow motion, her authority crumbling with every shrill word. The radio crackled, and the female officer returned. "Property's registered to her," she said, nodding at me. "No HOA lien, no disputes on file." Karen froze, her mouth gaping like a fish pulled from the tide. I exhaled, relief flooding through me. "Told you," I said, crossing my arms. The officer turned to Karen. "You got anything to counter this?" She stammered, clutching her clipboard. The board has papers. I'll get them." But her bluff was paper thin, and we all knew it. "All right," the officer said. "You're trespassing, ma'am. Leave now, or we'll escort you out." Karen exploded again, yelling about lawsuits and injustice, but the movers were already packing up, eager to ditch this mess. When she lunged at me, spitting insults, the female officer grabbed her arm, twisting it behind her back. "That's enough," she snapped, cuffing Karen as she howled. They dragged her to the cruiser, her heels kicking up sand, her screams fading as the door slammed shut. I turned to the renters, guilt gnawing at me. "I'm so sorry," I said. "This wasn't supposed to happen." The groom shook his head, managing a weak smile. "You saved us. Thanks for coming." I waived their next week's rent, insisting they stay longer. They deserved peace after this chaos. As the police drove off with Karen, the moving van rumbling away, I stood on the porch, watching the waves roll in. The fight wasn't over. I'd press charges, make sure she paid, but for now, the house was mine again, quiet under the twilight sky. The beach house stood silent under a star-strewn sky as the police cruiser's taillights vanished down Shoreline Drive. The moving van was long gone, its tire tracks etched into the sandy lawn like a fading scar. I leaned against the porch railing, the cool wood pressing into my palms, and let the sound of the waves wash over me. The renters, still shaken but grateful, had retreated inside, their soft murmurs drifting through the open window. I'd waived their rent for the week and tacked on an extra few days, a small apology for the nightmare they'd endured. It wasn't enough, but it was a start. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table, sunlight streaming through the salt-streaked windows, and dialed my lawyer. Karen's arrest was just the beginning. I wanted her held accountable. Trespassing, harassment, Maybe fraud? I told him, recounting the chaos. She can't get away with this. He agreed, his voice crisp over the line. With the deed, the police report, and those renters' statements, we've got a solid case. I'll file today. I hung up, a weight lifting off my chest. This wasn't just about me. It was about protecting what my grandparents had built. Word spread fast in Seaside Heights. By noon, my phone buzzed with calls from neighbors, folks outside the HOA who'd dealt with Karen's schemes before. She tried to claim my shed was hers. One said, voice trembling with relief, "Thank you for standing up to her." Another admitted she'd bullied him into paying fines for a fence that predated her reign. We banded together, a ragtag coalition of fed-up homeowners, and filed a joint lawsuit. Karen's reign of terror had targeted more than just my beach house, and now we had the evidence to prove it. Notes, emails, even a forged letter she'd tried on someone else. The court date came a month later, a crisp October morning with the scent of autumn mingling with the salt air. Karen showed up in a too-tight blazer, her smugness replaced by a jittery edge. She spun wild tales, claiming the HOA had historical rights to our properties, but the judge wasn't buying it. My lawyer presented the deed, the police body cam footage, and a stack of testimonies from her victims. The renters took the stand, their honeymoon ruined by her threats, and the room grew heavy with their words. Karen's defense crumbled, her lawyer stammering as the judge's gavel loomed. The ruling was swift, guilty of trespassing, harassment, and attempted fraud. We won a hefty settlement, enough to force Karen to sell her gaudy house in the HOA enclave to pay up. The HOA itself scrubbed her name from their website, distancing themselves from the wreckage. I heard she moved inland after that, tail between her legs, but I didn't care to track her down. She'd taken up enough of my time. Back at the beach house, I stood on the porch one last time before heading home. The renters had left a thank you note taped to the fridge. "Best vacation ever. Thanks for fighting for us." I smiled, tucking into my scrapbook alongside the glowing reviews. The settlement money went into repairs, a new coat of paint, a sturdier roof, ensuring the house would stand for another generation. I could almost see my kids running across the sand someday, their laughter echoing my own childhood summers. Driving away, the ocean sparkled in my rearview mirror, a blue ribbon tying up the chaos of the past months. Karen was gone, the house was safe, and the legacy lived on. I turned up the radio, letting the miles roll by, knowing I'd face down a storm and come out stronger. The beach house wasn't just a place. It was a victory, carved in sand and salt, mine to keep.